The mare could not walk without listing to one side, her left foreleg trembling at each step, as though the ground itself were unreliable. She stood in the middle of the livery yard on a gray Thursday in October of 1887, and every man who passed her gave her the same long, pitying glance a person gives a thing that has already, in every sense that counts, ceased to exist. The drover who had brought her in that morning, a thick-necked man named Aldous Preck, had tried twice to sell her to the liveryman and twice been refused. He'd tried once at the mill, been laughed at, and now he stood in the yard with his hat pushed back and a price dropping in his mouth like a stone in still water. $15, he finally said. 15. And the small, plain woman standing at the fence with her arms folded and her eyes very still said yes, before the echo had settled. And Aldous Preck looked at her with something close to contempt and something close to relief, and he took the money and left without looking back at the mare again. The woman's name was Clara Voss. She was 34 years old and had been a widow for 13 months. And by the following afternoon, half of Harlan Crossing believed she had lost her mind entirely. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? They were wrong, of course. But it would take 6 years, one terrible winter, a spreading lameness that emptied every rival stable in the territory, and a confrontation in the middle of the town square on a bright cold morning in February of 1893, before anyone in Harlan Crossing was willing to say so out loud. By that morning, Clara Voss was standing in that same square with 16 working horses lined behind her, all of them descended from the mare the drovers had left, and the man who ran the Harlan Freight Company was red to the roots of his hair, and he was lying. And Clara knew it, and everyone present knew it too, and still she answered his fury, not with fury, but with a number, calm and exact, that made the whole square go quiet. But that morning in October of 1887 came first. The mare's name, before Clara gave her one, had been nothing. Drovers didn't name the animals they meant to leave. Clara walked her slowly from the livery yard to the small property she rented on the eastern edge of town, 3½ acres of grazed thin pasture behind a clapboard house that had not been painted since before Clara's husband, Ephraim Voss, fell from the grain elevator at the Kessler Mill in June of 1886. The fall had not killed him at once, which was the particular cruelty of it, and the 3 months between the accident and the end had eaten everything they had saved and a portion of what they had not. Clara had buried him in September and stayed. People had expected her to go back east to her sister's household, and when she did not go, they pitied her, which is a gentler word than what they actually felt, which was unease. She led the mare through the gate and into the pasture, and she stood watching the animal move, the way the left foreleg came down with that measured carefulness, not the wild flinch of acute pain, but the long habituated caution of something that had learned to manage. Clara had grown up on a farm in Indiana before she followed Ephraim west. She knew the difference between a horse that was broken and a horse that had found a way through. She knelt in the grass and ran her hands down the leg from knee to fetlock, slow and thorough, and what she found was a calcified old bowing of the flexor tendon, poorly healed, long past the crisis of it. The tendon had remodeled itself around the injury. The leg would never be perfect. The mare would never be a carriage horse or a working drover's animal or anything that required sustained speed. But Clara was not looking for speed. She named the mare Rue. The old man who lived in the small stone house at the property's north fence was named Theodore Back. He had come to Kansas from a village in Silesia 30 years earlier and had stayed because, as he once told Clara without apparent irony, the flatness of the land reminded him that God was not sentimental. He grew a kitchen garden and kept 3 Berkshire pigs and knew more about the health of working animals than anyone in Harlan Crossing, though no one asked him because he spoke in a patient, accented cadence that some people in town found effortful to follow. He had watched Clara lead the mare in through the gate, and now he leaned on the fence post with his arms crossed and said nothing for a long time. Finally he said, "The leg will hold what she is willing to carry." Clara looked up from where she was still crouching in the grass. She asked him what he meant. He said, "You cannot put the weight of yesterday's trouble on a thing and then ask it to carry tomorrow. The leg will hold what she is willing to carry. You must learn what that is." Clara looked at the mare. Rue was grazing already, pulling at the thin October grass with the unhurried concentration of an animal that had stopped expecting rescue and had simply decided to eat whatever was there. Clara thought Theodore might be giving her advice about a horse or advice about herself, and she decided it didn't matter because it was the same advice either way. She let Rue rest through the remainder of October, through November, through the first hard freeze of December, 1887. She fed her well, better than she could comfortably afford on the widow's income she was piecing together from taking in fine sewing and the small rent she collected from Ephraim's brother on a quarter section of wheatland to the south. Corn, good hay, a bran mash with molasses on the coldest mornings. The leg did not improve in the sense of becoming a normal leg, but the mare's condition improved in every other sense. The dull coat brightened, the ribs disappeared under new muscle, the eyes that had been flat and inward went watchful and interested. In the spring of 1888, Clara began to work her at a slow walk, then a longer walk, then a measured, patient trot on level ground. She kept a small notebook in which she recorded what she observed, written in the tight, economical hand of a woman who had always known that paper was not free. How many circuits of the pasture, how the leg looked before and after, what the weather was, whether Rue favored the leg more on cold mornings than warm ones. She did not share this notebook with anyone. It was her arithmetic, and it was private. Rue turned out to be something Clara had suspected, and Theodore had confirmed with a nod when she described it to him. She was of a draft lineage crossed somewhere back with a heavier warm blood, probably Percheron, or close to it, and she was, for all her damage, an extravagantly good-natured animal. She did not kick, she did not bite. She stood patient as stone while Clara worked around her. She had a deep, broad chest and hindquarters that suggested, despite the long neglect and the injury, an original architecture of considerable power. The child appeared in June of 1888. Her name was Della, and she was 9 years old, and she belonged in the vague and contested sense to a family named Furch, who rented the property 2 gates down from Clara's, a large, struggling family with a father who drank and a mother who was overwhelmed, and several older children who had long since stopped tracking where the younger ones went. Della had a talent for appearing at Clara's fence without sound or announcement, simply materializing at the post nearest the pasture gate, and watching Rue with the focused proprietary attention of someone who has decided, without negotiating it with anyone, that a thing is hers. Clara did not send her away. She had noticed that Rue moved differently when the child was at the fence, not more anxiously but more deliberately, as though performing for an audience that could be trusted. Clara put Della to work carrying water and measuring grain, and Della did these things with a precision that surprised her, and after 3 weeks Clara gave her a small wage of 5 cents a Saturday, which Della accepted gravely and spent, as far as Clara ever determined, on nothing visible. One morning Della said, without preamble, "She's going to have a foal, isn't she?" Clara had believed this for 2 weeks but had told no one. She asked Della how she knew. Della said she just did. It was the first of what would eventually be 11 foals over 8 years, a number that seemed in retrospect almost extravagant, but was in fact the arithmetic of a mare who had been given the conditions she needed and then left to perform according to her own considerable nature. The stallion Clara had arranged access to was a local stud, sound and workmanlike, nothing fancy, owned by Theodore's neighbor at the far end of the section. The fee was modest. The results were not modest. The first foal arrived in March of 1889, a colt, dark brown, who came into the world in the small hours of a sleeting night and stood on the stable floor with a kind of aggressive competence that made Clara laugh out loud in the lantern light, the first time she had laughed that way in nearly 3 years. She named him March for the month, which Della found insufficiently dignified but accepted. March was not lame. Neither were any of the foals that followed him. This seems like a simple statement, and it is a simple statement, but it was the whole engine of what happened next, because what Clara had understood when she knelt in the pasture grass and ran her hands down Rue's damaged leg was that the bowing of the flexor tendon was old injury, not hereditary defect. The bone structure beneath was sound. The bloodline was sound. She was not buying a broken horse. She was buying a broke-down horse, which is an entirely different thing, and the difference was worth, as it turned out, several $1,000s and the regard of an entire town, though the town did not know this yet. Clara kept it from knowing. This was deliberate. She had watched in the years since Ephraim died how Harlan Crossing treated new information about people it had already categorized. The category for Clara Voss was the widow who stayed when she should have gone, who spent $15 on a lame horse, who took in sewing and kept herself on 3½ acres, and clearly had not enough sense to recognize her own diminished situation. She understood that the moment she attempted to argue with that category, the town would redouble it. You cannot talk a town out of what it has decided to see. You can only accumulate the evidence until the weight of it becomes embarrassing. So she banked it low, like a coal under ash. March grew and was sold privately to a wheat farmer named Garber, 40 miles south in the spring of 1890, for $80. Clara recorded this in the notebook on the line next to Rue's original purchase price of $15, and the breeding fee of $4 and the accumulated feed costs she had been tallying since October of 1887. The arithmetic was becoming interesting. The second foal, a filly, she kept. The third, another colt, went to Garber's brother-in-law for $75. She was learning the market, which is to say, she was learning how patient she could afford to be. The answer was, very. She had no debt and modest but sufficient income from the sowing and the wheatland rent, and so she was under no pressure that the man who ran the Harlan Freight Company could manufacture for her. His name was Denton Holst. He was 47 years old in 1889, had been in Harlan Crossing since the early settlement years, and controlled the movement of freight between Harlan Crossing and 3 neighboring towns through a combination of genuine organizational ability, inherited capital from his father's store in Ohio, and a persistent habit of setting prices just below the level at which anyone could afford to compete with him, and just above the level at which his customers could afford to refuse him. He was not stupid. He understood leverage the way some men understand the weather, not as a phenomenon to be morally evaluated, but simply as a condition to be used. He kept 11 horses himself and employed 4 drivers and had a monopoly on the bulk freight contracts for the Harlan Mill and the 2 grain elevators and the mercantile, which together represented nearly everything that moved in or out of the town in any quantity. He was also, in ways he did not fully recognize, deeply afraid of uncertainty, which meant he watched what other people were doing more carefully than he let on, which meant that by the summer of 1890, when Garber and Garber's brother-in-law both began writing to Clara rather than driving to Holst's yard when they needed working animals, Holst noticed. He did not ask Clara about it directly. He was not that kind of man. He mentioned it to people in passing with a casual generosity of condescension. The widow had come into a bit of luck with that lame nag. Apparently, seemed to breed true enough. Surprising. He offered to buy March's younger brother, the colt she had kept and not yet sold, in October of 1890. He came to the fence, which was how he managed people, standing at the edge of their property and looking over it with the proprietary calm of a man who has already priced the thing he is considering, and he offered her $60 for the colt, who was then 18 months old and already showing a depth of chest that made every knowledgeable person who saw him stop walking. Clara declined. He said 65, and she said, "No, thank you, Denton," and he said 70, and she said the same, and he said he supposed she knew best, with an inflection that made it clear he supposed no such thing, and she nodded pleasantly, and he left. Theodore was at the north fence that evening, and he said, without turning from the horizon, "Some men offer a price, and some men offer a sentence." He meant Holst's prices were propositions about what Clara was worth, not what the colt was worth, and accepting one of them would have been accepting the proposition. Clara told him she understood that. He said, "The leg holds what it is willing to carry." He had said this to her many times now in various forms, and she had come to hear it as a way of saying, "You know the load. Don't let someone else name it." By the winter of 1891, there were 6 horses on the property, Rue and 5 of her offspring at various stages, and the 3½ acres were becoming somewhat crowded, and Clara negotiated an arrangement with the widow Greer, whose husband had left her 40 acres and no desire to farm them, to use 12 of those acres as additional pasture in exchange for a portion of the hay yield and the labor of putting up the fence, which Clara and Della, who was now 14, and nearly as strong as Clara herself, did over the course of 3 weeks in late September, driving posts in the hard prairie ground until their hands were stiff at the end of each day. Della had continued to come every day through all of it, the early years of hauling water and measuring grain, and then the harder years of post-driving and fence-stretching, and the careful daily records in the notebook that Clara kept, and Della, who had sharp arithmetic of her own, had begun contributing to, writing in the margins in her smaller, rounder hand. Della was not being paid a child's wage anymore. She was being paid a real wage, and she understood that it was a real job, and she brought to it the same focused proprietary attention she had brought to watching Rue from the fence in June of 1888. The horses were in some way that neither she nor Clara discussed directly, hers as much as Clara's. She had named most of them. She knew their particular temperaments and tolerances the way you know a family you have actually chosen. The winter of 1892 arrived early and stayed long, and it was a killing season for horses in the Harlan Crossing territory. A disease moved through the horse population that veterinarians from the county seat identified when they finally came out in January as a degenerative joint condition that seemed to have spread through shared water sources in several of the larger communal stables, and it was particularly lethal in animals that had been bred for show quality over hardiness, which described the majority of the better horses in Holst's stable and in the stables of the 2 other prosperous men in the county who maintained large working strings. It was not a gentle thing to witness. The animals that had the most pedigree, the most careful handling, in the name of a kind of prettiness, the most expensive diet that had somehow never translated into robust condition, sickened first and worst. Holst lost 7 animals between November of 1892 and February of 1893. His neighbor Arndt lost 5. The Harlan Mills' own draft team, 4 animals, was reduced to 2, and those 2 were not reliable. Rue's offspring did not sicken. This was not magic or luck, though there would be people in Harlan Crossing who would use both words, with an edge of something uncomfortable beneath them, as though good fortune in someone they had dismissed required a suspicious explanation. What it was the accumulated effect of being bred from a line that had survived hard conditions by being fundamentally hardy rather than superficially fine, combined with Clara's practice of maintaining her horses on separate, individual water sources and exercising them on a regular varied schedule that built real muscular and systemic condition rather than the groomed appearance of it. Her horses looked like working animals because they were working animals, trained from young ages on the level ground west of town, where Clara had for the past 2 years been hiring her string out to farmers for short hauls and light freight work, quietly, without advertisement, at a fare rate slightly below Holst's, building a clientele the way you build anything that is supposed to last, one careful season at a time. When the disease took hold in November and Holst's drivers began coming in each morning to find another animal down, he did not at first understand what he was facing. He bought 2 replacement horses from a dealer in Wichita in December, paid handsomely for them, and by January they were sick as the rest. He had 6 functional animals remaining and 11 contracts for freight movement in February, and this was an arithmetic that did not balance, and he knew it. He came to Clara's fence on a Tuesday evening in late January of 1893. He had not been there since his offer of $70 on the colt in 1890, which the colt's eventual purchaser, a farmer named Height from the north part of the county, had sold on the following year for $140, which was the kind of number that moves through a small community like water through limestone, quietly and completely. Holst stood at the fence and looked at the pasture and at the 6 horses visible in the early dark, their breath white in the cold air, their condition unmistakable. He said, "I wonder if we might discuss a loan of some of your animals for the February contracts." Clara said, "A loan." He said, "A rental arrangement, naturally, with compensation." She asked him what compensation he had in mind. He named a figure. It was low. It treated her horses as emergency equipment rather than as the result of 6 years of deliberate, costly, unglamorous work. It treated her, in other words, the way he had always treated her, and she was not surprised by it, and she showed no sign that it registered as an insult because she had decided, probably months earlier, how this conversation would go, and showing him that she understood the insult would only complicate the simplicity of what she was about to do. She told him she would need to think on it. He came back Thursday. She told him she was still considering. He was not accustomed to being made to wait by people he had positioned as subordinate, and the waiting did something to his composure that was faintly visible at the corners of his jaw. On Friday he raised his offer. It was still low, but it was no longer an insult, and Clara told him she appreciated his time and that she would have an answer for him the following week. On the following Monday she told him she would prefer to settle the matter in a more public way. So there was no confusion about the terms, and she suggested the square on Wednesday morning, where the millmen and the mercantile owner and several of the affected farmers were already gathering most mornings to discuss the freight situation. He could not refuse this without making the refusal itself a statement, and he knew it, so he agreed. The morning was bright and cold, a thin snow from the previous night still white on the ground, the kind of February morning that makes everything visible and nothing comfortable. Clara stood in the square with Della beside her. She was 39 years old. She had been in Harlan Crossing for 7 years, a widow for 6 years of them, and she had spent those years being pitied and dismissed and left alone with her arithmetic. And now she stood in the square, and her arithmetic was the only arithmetic anyone present that morning was in a position to use. Holst arrived with 2 of his drivers, and with a face arranged in the expression of a man who is prepared to be reasonable, which is a different expression entirely from a man who is actually reasonable. He made a show of greeting several of the farmers by name, establishing the sociability of the occasion. Then he turned to Clara and said he had in mind a number, and the number he said was the same low number he had offered at the fence the first time. Clara let the silence sit for a moment. The square was not large, and the men who were there were close enough to hear a quiet voice. She said, "Denton, I had 6 horses working around this country last year, and you knew it, and I suspect you knew it better than most, because I am told you spoke with Height in November about the condition of his animals, and Height told you he had 4 of my string on a 3-month trial, and they hadn't missed a day, which is how you knew the number 4 when I said nothing to you about any number." Holst went still. She said, "The 4 is fine, Denton. You're welcome to have heard it. But a man who's heard the numbers ought to price them accordingly." He said too quickly that he'd heard the number from Garber, not Height. She said, "I didn't say Height first. I said Height." The square was very quiet. Theodor Bach, who had walked into town that morning for flour and had stopped at the square's edge with his flour sack under his arm, watched the moment the way he watched weather, with the settled patience of someone who had seen this particular sky before. Holst recovered himself. He said the number he was prepared to offer was fair for a rental arrangement, and that Clara should consider the opportunity of the exposure, the goodwill it would build. Clara said, "I'll tell you what I'll offer. For 8 horses on a 60-day arrangement, covering the February contracts and whatever comes behind them through March, the rate is $9 per horse per week, which comes to $576 for the 8 weeks, payable in 2 installments, with a provision that any horse returned in lesser condition than it departed carries a penalty of $30 per animal. Feed and stabling on your side. Harness and drivers on your side." The number landed in the square, like a stone in shallow water. Several of the farmers looked at each other. The number was fair. It was the arithmetic of 6 years of cost and work and risk, and the particular, irreplaceable value of being the only person in the county with sound working animals in February of 1893. It was not the arithmetic of vengeance. It was not inflated to punish him or reduced to placate him. It was simply the correct number, arrived at by a person who had been doing this arithmetic alone for a long time and had gotten very good at it. Holst said the number was too high. Clara said, "Then I'll offer it to the mill directly." The mill owner, a man named Castle, who had been standing at the edge of the gathering and who had 2 grain elevators sitting on a February schedule they could not meet, said, from across the square, that he would discuss it with her after. Holst was looking at Cassell, and then at Clara, and then at the ground. There are men who, in the moment of understanding that they have miscalculated, become angry, and there are men who become very still, and Holst became very still, which Clara had half expected, because the anger was always there in him, but the stillness was what he did when he was actually thinking, and she wanted him to think. She said quietly enough that only he and Della and the nearest 2 or 3 men could hear it. "I'll do the arrangement at your number for 2 horses for the first 2 weeks. That puts 2 animals in your yard by Thursday and lets your drivers learn the handling. After 2 weeks, you tell me if they suit you, and we go from there." He looked at her. She said, "They'll suit you." He said after a long moment that he supposed they could try that. Clara nodded. She turned, and she and Della walked back across the square toward the edge of town and the pasture beyond it. At the north fence, Theodore was already home, standing at the fence post, as he often was in the afternoons, watching the horses in the pale winter light. He said, "You asked less, and he will take more." He said it the way he said everything, as though it were a fact about weather, plain and not requiring agreement. Clara said yes. He said, "The leg holds what it is willing to carry, and now he knows what it is willing to carry." The 2 horses entered Holst's yard on Thursday. By the following Tuesday, one of his drivers had told 2 of the farmers, and both farmers had spoken to their neighbors. And by the end of the first week, there were 4 inquiries at Clara's gate about availability. The horses worked the February contracts without incident. They were returned in good condition. Holst paid the 2nd installment a week early, which was the closest he would ever come to saying what everyone in Harlan Crossing understood that February had said for him. Della recorded the full payment in the notebook in her smaller, rounder hand, and wrote beside it the date, and below the date she wrote the running total of what Rue and her offspring had produced in income since March of 1889, net of all costs, which was $1,147, and she drew a line under it, the way you draw a line under an argument you have finished making. The filly Clara had kept from the second foal was now 4 years old, and in full working condition, and she was already showing signs that she had inherited not only her mother's constitution, but her mother's disposition for the work, that same unhurried, concentrated willingness, and Clara had decided she would breed her in the spring. Rue herself was perhaps 16 years old by Clara's best estimate in the spring of 1893, a venerable age for a working mare, and she had slowed to a walk that was entirely ceremonial in nature, a progress around the pasture that looked less like locomotion and more like an old authority making its rounds. The left foreleg still came down with that measured carefulness, the long habituated caution of something that had learned to manage, and had managed, and had made from the managing something that Clara could not have dreamed of on a gray Thursday in October of 1887, when she said yes before the echo had settled. In the summer of 1893, the mercantile owner offered Clara a permanent contract for the freight movement between Harlan Crossing and 2 neighboring towns, a 3-year agreement with rates she had set. She signed it. She moved the operation to a larger property that she purchased outright on the western edge of town, 12 acres with a proper stable and a hay barn, and the deed was in her name, and she paid cash for it, and the man at the land office wrote the name Clara Voss at the top of the document with the ordinary unhurried authority of a man writing a name that has always been on deeds, which it had not always been, but which it would be from now forward. Della Furch, who was 15 in 1893 and had spent nearly 5 years learning every element of the work from grain ratios to conformation assessment to the patient, attentive management of a working string, came with her as a full partner in the operation, which they formalized in writing, which was unusual, and which also did not seem, once they had done it, to require any explanation. Some of the farmers who had laughed in the livery yard in October of 1887 came that autumn asking about horses. Clara sold them animals at fair prices. This required from her a certain deliberate setting aside of the memory of the laughter, but she found it less difficult than she had expected, because what she had discovered in 6 years of keeping a private notebook in a tight, economical hand was that the arithmetic of fair dealing compounded the same way all other arithmetic compounds, which is to say, quietly, steadily, and in ways that eventually exceed anything noisier. Theodore Beck came to see the new property in September of 1893, and he walked the stable and the pasture with his hands behind his back and the settled, evaluating patience of a man who has been right about something for a long time and takes no particular pleasure in being right, only in the fact that the rightness has produced a good outcome for a person who deserved one. He stopped at the fence at the far edge of the pasture and looked at the horses grazing in the early autumn light. He said, "A thing that survives the breaking sometimes carries the strength of the breaking inside it." He said it the way you say a thing when you are not saying it for the first time, which he was not. But Clara heard it differently in the September light, with 12 acres around her and her name on the deed. She said she was beginning to understand that. He said, "And now it is not one person alone." She looked at the pasture and at Della, at the far water trough, and at the 11 horses of various ages grazing in the long yellow grass, and she thought about Rue making her ceremonial walk around the old pasture on the eastern edge of town, the left foreleg coming down with its patient carefulness, carrying what it was willing to carry, and no more and no less. And she thought the old man was right, in the way that old men who are rarely consulted are sometimes ferociously right. She said, "No, not any more." The accounts of that first year on the western property showed a net of $408, which was real money in 1893 in Kansas, and was real proof of what happens when a dismissed thing is met with attention rather than contempt, with patience rather than noise, and with the particular steady courage of a woman who understood that being right is its own kind of reply, and that silence unnerves more than argument, and that the leg holds what it is willing to carry. In the spring of 1894, the filly Clara had kept bore her first foal, a colt, dark and broad-chested, who stood on the stable floor with the same aggressive competence his grandfather's line had always announced itself with. And Della named him, and Clara wrote the name in the notebook, and then she wrote beneath it, in the margin where she had always done her real arithmetic, the number 1, and circled it, and meant by it. A beginning, again.